Hello, everybody. How are we tonight? Good.
We are loud at the library.
Yeah, I think we can do a little bit better than that. How are we this evening? Much better. Thank you. My name is Sarah Colley. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator here at the Great Falls Public Library. And it is my joy and job to bring in awesome programming for this community. And I absolutely love being able to bring in incredible authors and presenters weekly to the library. We always have something going on, so please go on our website, check it out, follow us on Facebook, but be a part of the community and be a part of the Great Falls Public Library. In case of an emergency, I do have to say the emergency exit is out these doors to the right and then to the right again. Restrooms are out in the hallway, as well as a water fountain. And then, yeah, I will also open up the stairs after I walk away from this, so that you guys can take the stairs if you want to at the end of the program, because the elevator takes forever. So
Maybe don't push the button.
Yeah.
Renee's jumping up and down.
Today we have a wonderful author here, Leslie. Leslie blends her passion for food, great mysteries, and the Northwest in two cozy mystery series: the Spice Shop Mysteries, set in Seattle's Pike Place Market, and the Food Lovers Village Mysteries, set in Northwest Montana. As Alicia Beckman, she writes moody, standalone suspense. A three-time AGFA Award winner for Best Nonfiction, Best First Novel, and Best Short Story, and a nominee for the Anthony Derringer McCavity and Spurs Award. She is the president of the Sisters in Crime and former board member of Mystery Writers of America. She lives here in Montana. She's here to celebrate with us on, what did you call it, your grand tour?
My crazy excellent tour of Montana,
Yes.
the North Central.
So we are pleased to have her here. We're pleased to have Cassiopeia Books also selling all of the books here as well. So thank you all for coming out. And without any further ado, Leslie, it's all you.
Thank you,
Make sure
Sarah.
that you're on.
I think so.
Yeah, you are. Perfect.
Right. So thank you for the lovely introduction. One correction, I am a former president of Sisters in Crime, and no, that is not Deadly Nuns. It is a group of mystery and crime writers, readers, librarians, and other people in the industry. As Sarah said, I live in Montana. I am a Montana girl, born and raised in Billings, married to a Montana boy, Dr. Don Beans, who grew up here in Great Falls, and some of you know him, or at least know of him. He tells me that the portion of his youth that was not misspent was spent in the library. I didn't know about that portion. So I've not used one of these things before, so this is my okay, we'll do it the old-fashioned way. So, Sarah introduced the books and told you about the two different series, and see, she's so much smarter than I am. Yeah, okay. There we go. And here are all the books, and we do have them here tonight. The Food Lovers Village series, which is on the right, that's set in a fictional version of Big Fork. I call it Jewel Bay. If you've ever been to Big Fork, you won't be fooled. And I had to change the name so I could kill people. We have 5 novels and a short story collection, and then a couple of short stories have appeared in other anthologies. On the left, we have the Spice Shop Mysteries. As Sarah said, they are set in Pike Place Market in Seattle. Like a lot of Montana kids my age, I left for college, went to Seattle, and then came back. So I come about my knowledge of the city and my love of the market, honestly. There are 8 novels so far, and the 9th will be out this summer. The 2 standalone suspense novels. People always ask, you finally write a book set in your hometown, Blind Faith, set in Billings, and you write it under another name. What's up with that? Well, the publisher asked me to use a different name to avoid confusion. But I love the name, Alicia Beckman. It honors my mother and grandmother, and it's a lot easier to spell than Budewitz. So a couple of nice comments about the Spice Shop books. To Air as Cumin came out last summer, and Lavender will be out this next summer. And I do want to mention Blind Faith in particular because it is a really special book for me. It's set, as I said, largely in Billings, with some scenes in other towns in Montana, including Deer Lodge, in the prison, where I have been many times, but always with the ability to get out on request. I am a lawyer as well. And there are some scenes set in Portland. It is a contemporary cold case investigation and then a historical mystery that works its way forward. So we've got a dual timeline and shifting point of view characters. Okay, so I'm here today to share my passion for a remarkable figure in Montana history, Mary Fields, who is the subject of my latest book, All God's Sparrows and Other Stories, the Stagecoach Mary Fields collection, which are stories set between 1885, Mary's first year in the territory, and 1914, the year that she died in Cascade. There's a little bit of mystery and a lot of history. I need to stress, I am not a trained historian. I am a novelist and a lawyer, and because of that, I do have the ability to do some research and to ask questions, which I think is what historians do as well. My purpose in my research was never to document Mary's life, but to be able to bring her to life on the page for all of you. And so I'm sharing with you what I have learned along the way. I'm going to talk about her and what we know about her. The facts are limited, and then expand into the larger historical context, that is the Black experience in the American West, or in Montana in particular, and talk about the role of historical fiction, why we love it, what it does for us. I will leave time for questions, and hopefully I will also have answers, and then we do have books for sale. So, excuse me, I'm dry today. Mary Fields was born into slavery in about 1832, probably in Tennessee, at least according to what she told the 1910 census taker, possibly in West Virginia. She didn't know her birthday. She chose to celebrate on March 15th. In her later years, the town, or Mary, it's not clear which, threw a birthday party for her, and I'm told that the school even closed so that the town children could celebrate with her. Let's focus first on this photo on the left. That's the one that is on the cover of the book, All God's Sparrows. It is a studio photo, taken probably about 1897. My honey tells me that that is a Lee Enfield rifle. We don't know if it was hers or a studio prop. I choose to believe the dog was hers. I named him Jess, and I put him in every story. It's not clear what gun she's carrying in the center picture. Frank, do you know?
No, I do not.
Okay. If we saw a better version of that picture, we might know whether it was a rifle or a side-by-side double-barreled shotgun. She was known to have carried a pistol in her pocket as well. We don't know if she spent her childhood on a plantation or more likely on a smaller farm. There's a terrific history book called Lady Blackrobes, Missionaries in the Heart of Indian Country by the Ursuline sister Irene Mahoney. And Sister Irene Mahoney writes that Mary was the daughter of a field hand and a house slave, and the surname Fields may be some confirmation of that. We really don't know anything about her life until 1870, when she was working as a chambermaid and cabin assistant on a steamship on the Mississippi River. And the name of the ship is ironic. It is the Robert E. Lee. The Lee was involved in a famous race on the Mississippi between St. Louis and New Orleans, setting a speed record that was never beaten. And I understand Mary often talked about how exciting that had been. Later, she worked in Akron, Ohio for Judge Edmund Dunn and his family. How she got from the Mississippi over to Akron in the northeastern corner of the state, we don't know. It might have been through someone she met on a steamship. I should probably mention that I spent several hours today, Dawn and I spent several hours today with Frank LaLiberty from Cascade, who is a historian of the area as well, and he knows things I don't know, and he may know some things that I'm not telling you, or he may know that some of the things I'm telling you are controversial. We'll let him tell us that later. But it does make me a little bit nervous to be standing in front of someone who does know the subject matter so well. And of course, I'm sure all of you know quite a bit about that time as well. So Judge Dunn had two younger sisters, Mary and Sarah Teresa, who was born in 1846. And Sarah Teresa is important to our story. Both girls went to school at the Ursuline Academy in Toledo in the 1850s, and they later entered the convent. Sarah Teresa took the name Amadeus, not for Mozart, but for a priest she admired. And she later became Mother Superior Amadeus. Now, Mary Fields knew Amadeus from the judge's family and household. When the judge's wife died in 1875, Mary took the children to Toledo to the convent and stayed. And she worked at the convent, she had her own rooms, and we can assume that her friendship with Amadeus deepened in those years. And this is Amadeus Dunn in about 1884, the year that she came to Montana. So for context, I'm going to move out a bit and talk a little about the Ursulines and Jesuits in Montana, and then come back to Mary. In January of '84, Amadeus and 5 other nuns came to Montana to open schools for girls at the Jesuit missions to the Indians, at the request of the Jesuits. They took the train to Miles City in the far southeastern corner of the state. First time I gave this presentation when the book came out was in Bigfort, and a friend of mine said to my husband afterwards, I don't know where all those places she talked about are. So, we have a map. Miles City, over in the far eastern corner of the state. I was there 2 weeks ago. The Ursulines arrived there in midwinter, January of '84. It was a cold, nasty winter, and they were not greeted in the manner we would have hoped, and they had a hard time. But they did get their school started. It was called Sacred Heart. It was run by the Ursulines for many years. It is now run by the Diocese of Great Falls, Billings. They also went to St. Labray, which I did not put on the map, but it is, if you drew a line between Miles City and Billings and went south, that is the mission to the Northern Cheyenne. And the Ursulines, again, ran that for many years, but now the diocese runs it. The Jesuits were some of the earliest white men in Montana, coming to Montana in the 1840s. They were tremendous surveyors, explorers, and mission makers, mission establishers. Their first mission was at St. Mary's outside of Stevensville, which is about, well, I don't know how far. How far is Stevensville south of Missoula, Don? Do you remember? 20, 30 miles?
Yeah.
Yeah. That mission still exists. The mission church still exists. There is a contemporary parish there right next to it, but you can tour the original church and what is left of that mission. That mission served the Salish Indians, the Bitterroot Salish, and it later moved up to St. Ignatius, which is about 45 miles north of Missoula, in 1890, when the Salish were forcibly removed from the Bitterroot and sent to the Mission Valley. Some of you may have visited the St. Ignatius Mission Church. I know that Frank told us he and his wife were married there some 50 years ago. It's a beautiful little church with paintings by Brother Carignano, who traveled from Gonzaga in Spokane to paint them. It is worth a visit. Don and I were there for a wedding about a year ago, and the church has been restored. It's been stabilized. The brickwork has been repaired. The windows have been repaired, and the paintings have been restored, and it's really quite lovely. There are also some other outbuildings still existing. The school buildings are gone, but the grist mill and some of the cabins the women lived in are still there. The Jesuits started St. Peter's in 1859 as a mission to the Blackfeet, and my understanding is that the Blackfeet actually asked Father de Smet to send missionaries to the Blackfeet. You might look at that and know where the reservation is and think that's a long ways away. Well, the reservation was shrunk considerably and was much larger than now. The mission moved 3 times before landing at its final location, which is about 12 miles west of Cascade. And of course, you know Cascade, south of here along the river. They started that mission, they started it several years before they actually established residency there. And they moved around quite a bit, and I won't go into the explanations for that. In 1874, they started this little white church, which I just learned today they didn't complete until 1878. And when you go there today, it looks a little bit different from what you see here. That bell tower now, or in this photograph from 1885, is in the center of that L. But in fact, it is now in the front portion of the church. The back portion, the portion on the right, those cabins, were later moved. So you can see the nuns and several children who appear to be native children. And then you see Mary and her buckboard over on the far right. In November of '84, the Ursulines were still in south central Montana, southeastern Montana, and they came to St. Peter's, to the mission there, about 10 months after they arrived in the state. They arrived at St. Peter's to establish their schools for the girls there. And they were surprised to discover, Sister Mahoney tells us, that they were expected to wash, bake, mend, and knit for the Jesuits. They started 2 schools at St. Peter's in 1885, first for the white girls, who were the settlers' daughters, and then for the native girls. The Jesuits taught the boys until they left in 1897, and they too ran 2 different schools, for the settlers' children and for the native children. The curricula were different, and boys and girls were taught separately. When the Jesuits left in 1897, the Ursulines took over the boys' schools and essentially ran 4 schools at the same location. At its peak, there were over 200 native children, all boarders, as well as the settlers' children. And a fire destroyed several buildings in 1908. In 1912, they finally yielded to pressure from the bishop and moved to Great Falls, where they established the academy, and that is a building I'm sure all of you know. So back to Mary. In early 1885, Amadeus became deathly ill with pneumonia. 3 nuns and Mary immediately came west to nurse her. Amadeus recovered, and Mary stayed. Amadeus remained in Montana, overseeing the mission schools until 1905, when she went to Alaska to open mission schools there. And she died in the hospital in Seattle in 1919 at age 73, and she is buried at St. Ignatius. Remember, when these women came here, it was still Montana territory. We didn't become a state until 1889. This is Mount Angela Convent and School, which opened in January of 1892. In the photograph, it appears to be 3 stories, but I'm told there was also a basement, so we had 4. And it's quite a substantial building with made of limestone, quarried not that far away, but far enough away that you'll look when you go out there and say, how the heck did they do that? Just a very small portion of this building remains. I was tempted when I got back to the hotel room today to add some pictures to this, but that was too much work, so I didn't do it. You just have to imagine, oh, there's a pointer here. What we've got left is just about like that. And then we can see some stones over here in that corner, and that's it. That's it for that building. Pretty amazing.
Where is it located?
Where is it? That is at St. Peter's Mission.
Oh, okay.
So I'll show you a picture. It's not the greatest picture. This is what the mission looked like at one point, at its peak at 1897. And this is roughly 12 miles west of present-day Cascade. This is the church building that we saw earlier. This is Mount Angela. In this picture, they look further apart than they do on the ground. But it was quite a substantial settlement. This is the Jesuit stone seminary, stone school, and then they had a wooden building behind it that you can't see that was their seminary. This they called the Opera House. When I first saw it, I thought that someone had built a barn on top of an old stone foundation, because it doesn't look like that now. It was painted red and it's pretty much falling apart. But you can see that there were other residential buildings and cabins. I'm sure there was a grist mill, there was a laundry. They had a ranch, and so there are other buildings as well. At its peak, there were probably, well, if you think 220 native students, and then the settlers' children, students, and the Jesuits, the Ursulines, and all the other people who worked there, Frank estimates 500 people at one point. And so that's a pretty substantial number of people in this settlement, especially when you think that all that's left is this church and bell tower and this collapsing in upon itself opera house. Of the Jesuits building, there is a little bit of stonework left, and that's it. There is the cemetery, and I'm not sure if we can see that here. I don't think we can. It's going to be over here somewhere. The cemetery was used for the neighborhood as well as for the mission itself. So Mary stayed at the mission for 9 years. She came in March of '85, and she stayed for 9 years. What did she do there? Well, in the early years, she fished and hunted. She grew a garden. She raised chickens, apparently several hundred chickens, and she drove the wagon carrying people and freight. The Ursulines kept written records called annals, and they wrote that Mary did everything we couldn't. She left the mission in 1894. There had been trouble or reports of trouble, and the bishop in Helena finally told Amadeus that Mary needed to leave. And I'll share with you a quote that I quite enjoy. What the trouble had, well, we'll talk more about that trouble. So I love this quote. It again comes from the Annals, and it's quoted in Lady Blackrobes by Sister Mahoney. The bishop has ordered that Mary be dismissed from the mission, but the community, meaning the nuns, has determined to support her wherever she goes. The bishop has heard aspersions of the poor woman's character, which no one has ever yet been able to prove. She was overbearing and troublesome, and yet it was our intention to keep her till death. And I think this quote tells us a lot about Mary, but also about the depth of the bond between Mary and the Ursulines. So what was that trouble, and what triggered the bishop's decision that Mary needed to leave and that the Ursulines should have no more contact with her? Well, for one thing, she smoked, she drank, she used rough language, although that probably not around the children whom she loved. Some sources suggest that the last straw was an argument between Mary and a neighboring ranch foreman, possibly over a harness, while others say it was a dispute with a white hired hand who did not want to take orders from a black woman, especially one who was paid more than he was. Contrary to legend, no shots were fired. Mary moved into Cascade. She ran a restaurant for a year. It failed. The story is it was not because she couldn't cook, but because she wasn't a good businesswoman. Meanwhile, Amadeus, that crafty woman, subverted the bishop's order that the sisters have no more contact with Mary by helping her get the mail route between Cascade and the mission, ensuring that the nuns still saw her regularly. Mary Fields is believed to have been the first black woman awarded a star route, as delivery routes were called then in the country. She retired in 1904. She ran a laundry and babysat 10 children, including the feature actor Gary Cooper, who adored her. This drawing you may have seen. Charlie Russell is another legendary Montana figure. He lived in Cascade for a few years, and that's where he met his future wife, Nancy Cooper, who I do not believe was any relation to Gary Cooper. And he married her in 1897. That's the year that he created this drawing. You can see Mary sitting on the ground in the front where she has tripped over a hog and spilled her basket of eggs. The late historian Ellen Baumler wrote that Mary didn't like this drawing. She thought it made her look like a fool. Russell claimed the drawing was a composite of events that actually happened. Who knows, both were larger than life figures. Mary died in December of 1914. And my understanding is there was no Catholic church in town at the time, and her funeral was held at the Pastime Theater, which was new and was also the largest building in town. So we'll go back to these images for a moment. When I first read about her, and I'm not honestly sure when that was, I was instantly fascinated. And by the response I see online to articles about her, and elsewhere. I think that other people are too. And so of course I wanted to write about her. It's important to talk about the forgotten figures of the past, many of them women or people of color. My theory is that Mary is interesting in part because she brings together three inherently fascinating aspects of the American West. One is the experience of the formerly enslaved who moved west after the Civil War. One is the missionary era, and the third is the woman on her own. With Mary, we also have a significant amount of myth. Myth-making is a huge subject and not one that I'm competent to address, but it's always played a huge part in our understanding of the West and its history, its land, and people. Myth is spread by art, illustration, admittedly by novels, but especially by cowboy movies. And there is a recent book, True West, Myth and Mending on the Far Side of America, by Betsy Gaines Quammen of Bozeman, which explores how those myths still influence life in the West today. If you Google Mary or you see a post on Facebook, you're likely to run into some unverified claims, some myths, and so it was important to me in my stories that I not fall into that trap and that I correct as many of those as I could and provide a larger context. For example, it's often said that she was 6 feet tall, wore men's clothing, and shot a man. She did like baseball, and this is a photo of the Cascades baseball team, called the Cascades, in the early 1900s. You can see Mary over on the far right. She's taller than some men, shorter than others. And in that era, in the early 1900s, the average man was 5'7" or 5'8". It's clear that she was a full-size woman, but she probably was not 6 feet. We do have this second photo taken that same day. She looks a little taller, but you can also see that other men were as tall or taller than she, and maybe the angle has something to do with it. We don't know. In any case, she was, as I say, a full-size woman and tall, but probably not 6 feet. You'll have noticed, though, that in every one of these photographs, she's wearing a skirt. Now, if we go back here, we can see in this middle photo, she is probably wearing a men's jacket. That would have been practical because of her size and because she worked outdoors so much. A woman's jacket of the time would have been more fitted and made more for style than for warmth or comfort. I mentioned there had been some trouble, aspersions as the nuns wrote, and there is a report that when she ran the restaurant she may have punched a man who didn't pay his bill, but there is no credible evidence that she ever shot anyone. Still, the belief that she could take a shot might have helped protect her. So let's talk about the Black or African American experience in the West. And here we have another Russell image, the painting of York, which is in the Historical Society in Helena, and you can see York in the center. He is the first black man known to have visited what is now Montana. He was William Clark's slave, so he came here in 1804. The journals kept by various members of the Corps of Discovery report that the Indians were very curious about him because of the texture of his hair and by how dark his skin was, and that's what led to this Russell painting. This is James Beckworth. I really like him. He was born into slavery in Virginia in about 1798, and he came west in the 1820s. How he got his freedom, I don't know. He was a mountain man, a trapper, and a soldier. There's a pass in the Sierra Madres named for him, and I learned that fact from Jeopardy! But I did verify it. He lived with the Crow or Absaloka in Crow country in what is now southeastern Montana, married a Crow woman, and died there in 1866. There was, of course, a surge in westward migration after the Civil War of both white and black Americans. One essay I read summarized the drivers of westward migration during Reconstruction as economic opportunity, freedom to form and maintain family life, and maintaining it was important because many families had been separated during slavery. Freedom from continued violence, including sexual violence, and democratic opportunity. In other words, self-determination. And I suspect that that was a major factor in why Mary stayed. But of course, prejudice and problems came west too. There is a nice section of history about the African American or Black experience in the 19th century and early 20th century, well, the 19th and 20th centuries, on the Montana Historical Society website. And an essay there said this: the early Black community in Montana is characterized by 4 general periods of development: migration, opportunity, expansion, and finally exodus. And we see that with these statistics, which all come from census data, and I took them from books I'll mention later by Anthony Wood and Michael Johnson. 1870 was the first year that the census records give us a full picture of the Black population in the country. Because until then, slaves had not been listed by name. They were listed as property. And so it might be male 42, female 39, male 12. They were not listed by name until 1870. So that is an important year in tracking the Black population anywhere, and also in Montana Territory. You can see we had less than 200 Black people in a territorial population of 20,000. In 10 years, that number had almost doubled. And the interesting thing to me is that 2/3 of those children were born in Montana, which tells us that families were here. The number continued to grow. By 1910, we had 2,000 out of 376,000, and that is the peak for that early era. Why is that the peak? There were a number of factors. Urbanization, the agrarian movement was shifting and more people were moving to cities, but also we had a ban on interracial marriage that was enacted by our legislature in 1909, and it took effect in 1910. The act that finally took effect banned marriage between white people and Black people or Asians. Earlier versions had been proposed that banned marriage between whites, Blacks, Asians, or Indians, but there were too many important families that were of blended races, and so that proposal didn't pass. And so then we did see a significant drop in the number of Black people after that. The ban was upheld in 1942 by the state Supreme Court and ultimately repealed in 1953. Anthony Wood, in his research, traced all the Black families that were listed in the 1910 census, I believe, and he traced where they went so that he could see who was still here and who had left, and he documented a pretty significant impact. Here's where I wanted to mention this slide. This is a book called African American Women Confront the West, edited by Quintard Taylor and Shirley Ann Moore. It was the first book I read with a lot of research that covered the entire western part of the country. And I found it really interesting, and one of the things I wanted to mention to you was the essay in there, Women of the Great Falls African American Methodist Episcopal Church, 1870 to 1910 by Peggy Riley, which drew on local materials and interviews from members of that church, which still exists. And so if that's not in your collection, it should be, but it is certainly a book that might interest some of you. So one of the things that interests me is when Mary left the mission in 1894, she didn't come to Great Falls with its significant, small but significant Black community. She didn't go to Helena, which had a Black community. Why? She stayed in Cascade, where she seems to have been the only Black person. That suggests to me that she found a community and a freedom there that she values. And of course, the proximity to the nuns was likely a factor. I mentioned the Montana Historical Society website has a full section on African American history in the West. And I also want to mention a site called blackpast.org, which is a project of Dr. Taylor, who I'm pleased to say gave me a quote for my book. He did it in exchange for me writing an essay about Mary on the website. It is not up yet, but hopefully it will be soon. One thing else I wanted to mention before we move on is talking about the Black cowboys. because they too are a subject of great myth and myth making. And Dr. Taylor, also a trained historian who crawled through the census records, as I've not done, says that about 2% of the total number of cowboys in the West were black. And I love the census categories that he looked at: stock raisers, herders, and drovers. So we can't talk about the black experience in the West without talking about the black cavalry. This photo was taken at Fort Shaw in 1894. It belongs to the Montana Historical Society. These are the Buffalo Soldiers, and I love this photograph. They were in Montana from 1888 to 98 at several forts, including Fort Keogh near Miles City, Fort Missoula, and Fort Shaw. And Mary may well have met some of them. They were the first black units in the regular army. There were ultimately about 25,000 of them, largely commanded by white officers, although over time there became a handful of African American officers. Many of you have seen the movie Glory with Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick as Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who was killed in action during the Civil War and is the namesake of Fort Shaw. That was the first black regiment in the Union Army, but it was a wartime special unit, not the regular army. The Buffalo Soldiers were sent west. It was thought that using them in the South and to a lesser extent in the Northeast would provoke racial violence. But there were some incidents in the West, including the lynching at Fort Shaw. The soldiers' duties included protecting the border, mines, and railroads, and suppressing what was called Indian rebellion. In Montana, their main responsibility was to protect the settlers from Indian hostilities. The duties shaped the relationships between the black community and the native peoples. To the soldiers, the Indians were a problem. To the Indians, the soldiers were oppressors. I'm sure that civilian attitudes towards the soldiers varied depending on the nature of contact between them. A handful did stay in Montana, largely in Great Falls. I promised a reference to some references. A Black Woman's West, The Life of Rose B. Gordon by Michael Johnson is a really interesting book. I enjoyed it quite a lot. And these references are all on my website. It is the story of Rose and the Gordon family, who came here to White Sulphur Springs in the 1880s. But it also has quite a bit of historical analysis and data, and so it gives you a larger context of the black experience. It's a good mix of history and biography, quite readable. If you have read Ivan Doig's Prairie Nocturne, the main character is a black gospel singer from Montana who becomes an international star as part of the Harlem Renaissance. That character is based on Taylor Gordon, Rose's younger brother. I mentioned Black Montana by Anthony Wood, subtitled Settler Colonialism and the Erosion of the Racial Frontier. This is a more academic book. It probably had, I think it had its origins in a PhD thesis, but it too is a very interesting book. I love Beyond School Marms and Madams. It's a collection of about 100 essays on women in Montana published by the State Historical Society. It includes essays about several black women, including Mary, Sarah Bickford of Virginia City, and others, several Native American women, and a couple of Chinese women from Butte. Letters of a Woman Homesteader has absolutely nothing to do with the black experience in Montana, but I put it up there because I love it. Eleanor Pruitt was a widow with a young daughter who worked as a laundress to a family in Denver. And in 1909, she decided that she wanted to create something of her own. And so she moved to southern Wyoming and established a homestead, determined to prove up, which she did. These are letters that she wrote back to her employer in Denver. And the employer had the foresight to send them to the Atlantic Monthly, which published them in 1913-14, and this collection is still in print. I discovered it when I worked in a bookstore 40 or 50 years ago. Yes, that long ago. And I loved it, and every time I write something historical, I read it again, because I want to get the feel of the time and place. It's a little bit different geographically. It's southern Wyoming. It's a little later, 1909 to 14. But I wrote a novella set in Big Fork in 1910, and I reread this before I wrote that, and I reread this before I wrote my Mary stories, because I love it. I love how she gives us the details, what she did of a day, and what it took to create a life on the land by herself with that little girl of hers in that time. She did later marry Stuart, the Scotsman who had the homestead next door, and have another child with him. One story she tells sticks with me. She and several other women were going on a little camping trip. And they packed their wagon and they went and they got to where they were going and discovered they'd forgotten the grub box. How do you forget the grub box, right? Well, so she, Eleanor, just laughed about that, and they made do. When I wrote my own story, in the novella that anchors the story collection, Mary and Amelia go on a little road trip, and I made sure they remembered the grub box, and I knew what to call it because of Eleanor Stewart. I want to talk a little bit about the missionary era and the Indian boarding schools. It's an uncomfortable subject, but it's one that has to be talked about and has to be faced. The missions were primarily Catholic, run by the Jesuits, but there were also Methodist and Presbyterian missions. And I have looked only at the Catholic movement, and I'm not an expert on it, and clearly, as you see, I am a white woman. But it is important, I think, that we know about this. And the Indian school movement was, frankly, it was part of the conquest strategy. The goal was assimilation, summed up in kill the Indian, save the man. The religious missionaries' version of that was the belief in the need to save the Indians' souls. There were some tribes, some families, some individuals who thought that education would help them fight and work for their people in the face of what by the late 1800s seemed inevitable. Education became mandatory. In many cases it was forced. There were kidnappings. There were loss of culture, language, customs, and the impact, of course, is still felt, and it's still one that many are working to heal. Here in Montana, we have long known about some of the abuses that occurred at the schools, the physical, sexual, and cultural abuse. Thanks in part to the courage of the survivors who attended the St. Ignatius schools from the 1940s to 1960s. And they were among the first people in the country to bring a wide-scale lawsuit against the church and specific orders. And that led to larger investigations and ultimately to financial settlements. And both dioceses in Montana eventually published lists of known abusers, including 2 priests I knew as a child in Billings. And I will tell you that I am grateful that that list did not come out while my mother was still alive, because she knew those men. The Washington Post published an analysis of those records last year, and it breaks them down by mission school. The records go way back. St. Peter's is not listed, but I think it would be naive to believe that nothing happened there, because abuses happened in that same era in the other schools, although most of the sexual abuse seems to have been in the 50s and 60s. And I do not know the position of the Blackfeet tribe on the issue or what tribal memory says. The response of the various religious orders varies. There has been, as I said, litigation, but there have also been public apologies and much grief. And project to open records and provide access. One complication is that some of the religious women's orders no longer exist or are much smaller than they were. I believe as a society we have an obligation to address this shame and its continuing impact, and I am grateful for the apologies issued by the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops and President Biden, overdue as they were. And I hope that the remarkable work done by the Department of Interior under Secretary Holland will continue. 2 novels touch on this subject. They are both based on the lives of real women. Perma Red by Deborah Magpie Erling came out more than 20 years ago. It is a fictionalization of her aunt's experiences at the St. Ignatius Mission in the 1940s and their impact on her. It is a difficult read. It is a powerful book, but it is not an easy read. Crow Mary by Kathleen Grissom came out a couple of years ago, and I'm pleased to say that Kathleen also gave me a quote for All God's Sparrows. It is set in the Crow country and eastern part of Montana and up into Alberta. Crow Mary was a young woman, teenager, when she married Abe Farman, Abe, who was a white fur trapper. And they went from Crow country up to Fort Benton and then up into Alberta and back down and eventually settled again in Crow country. And Mary's two children embody what we mentioned earlier, the different approaches to, or different attitudes towards education. Both were sent by their father, without Mary's consent, to the infamous Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. The daughter stayed and got a nursing education because she wanted to bring that home to help her people. The 11-year-old boy and another slightly older Indian boy from the school escaped and made their way west. And can you imagine two young boys coming from Pennsylvania back out to Crow country by themselves? But they did it. And so they demonstrate or illustrate the different choices there about school. I think we will see more research and books, both fiction and nonfiction, touching on this issue in the next few years. So let's talk about historical fiction. I think all of you must enjoy it to some extent, or you wouldn't be here this evening. You like history, and hopefully you like historical fiction too. It may seem contradictory at first, but historical fiction helps us get at the truth, to understand what was happening in an era. It's sort of a shorthand introduction for readers who are interested, but who are not going to read all those biographies and academic texts. As one reader told me, as authors, we're sneaking the history in on you. As with Mary, it helps us fill in the gaps. What I've done is taken the stories about Mary and her big heart and amplified them. I've put her and Amadeus in the time and place, so you can go there with me. Historical fiction also helps us understand our own time and place. My friend, the late mystery writer Victoria Thompson, often said that it was easier to talk about social issues and problems in the past, even when those issues still exist today. Frank commentary about racism, for example, in a contemporary setting can be quite difficult, and it can be, in lesser hands, preachy. But because humans haven't changed a whole lot, as she said, in every era we kill each other, love and hate each other, a writer can show human flaws more easily in that historical context. Of course, we have a responsibility to be as true to the facts as we can be. And that's part of our compact with you as readers. You trust us to tell you the truth about what happened, and that's what allows us to get at the emotional truth. As I said earlier, one of my goals is to talk about the forgotten people. It is important to remind readers who was here. There is not a lot of fiction about the Black experience in the American West. There's a list on my website, and if you know of others, please drop me a line. Why is it important to talk about those people? Because they were here. And if we want to understand the time and place, we need to know who was here. So these stories, there are 3 short stories originally published in Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine, and a historical novella, which is a longer piece. They feature Mary, and they involve nuns, the real Amadeus, and the fictional Sister Louisine, a young girl who is part Blackfeet, and her mother. One story involves a working woman, which was the code of the day for a prostitute, and then we have a picture bride. The recurrent themes are the woman on her own, the social constraints, societal constraints, and how they influence the choices women made, and the search for justice and mercy in unlikely places. Now, I realize those can sound like heavy themes, but I promise you they're not. The stories are actually quite fun. The title story, All God's Sparrows, the title refers to the pregnant mother in the story, the mother of a little girl, whose people called her Little Bird. And I want you also to think, as you read it, about the line in Matthew that God cares for the least of the sparrows. There's a story called Coming Clean that was sparked by a real incident recounted in Sister Irene Mahoney's book, Lady Blackrobes. I don't want to spoil it, by saying what the incident was, but I do give the details in the afterword, along with some other historical facts that don't have a direct bearing on the stories, but are interesting. When I was writing the novella that anchors the story, or anchors the collection, it's called A Bitter Wind, I was really struggling to figure out who was the focus of the story besides Mary. And so I had a dream in which I saw a book cover with images that helped me identify the focus of the story. There's a little bit more about that in the afterword as well. The dream led me to create this collage on the left, which helped me visualize the story. And this painting on the right is a painting by the Helena, collage by the Helena artist Amy Brakeman-Livesey. And I tell you in the afterword how it plays into this, but she was my image of Amelia, the young woman who comes west to marry a man she has known only through correspondence. I showed this collage a few weeks ago at a library, and a man said to me, "Why the stamps? Mary was a postmistress." Actually, she was not technically a postmistress, but she did have the she is believed to have been the first black woman to have a star root in the country, and that was an equivalent rank. Plus, it gave me an opportunity to use my childhood stamp collection. There's a list of historical references on my website, lesliebudewitz.com. I hope you'll take a look and let me know of any others. So, let's go back to Mary here. That's what I wanted to share with you, and I would like to hear from you with your questions and anything more I can tell you about any of the books, but particularly this one, and any stories you want to tell me. Yes?
There's a group in Great Falls called Great Falls Rising.
Mm-hmm.
It started 8.5 years ago. And we got fascinated with Stagecoach Mary. We knew that there was a group going to the legislature trying to get a portion of not U.S. highway, but a lesser highway in the Cascade area designated as Stagecoach Mary Highway. Well, the legislature, in its wonder, decided they wouldn't do that.
They do make us wonder from time to time.
And so what we did was we went to the Department of Transportation and said that we wanted to designate a portion of the U.S. highway 2 miles north of Cascade as Stagecoach Mary Highway, and Great Falls Rising would be the ones that clean it up. So there is a sign north of Cascade for Stagecoach Mary.
That's wonderful. We missed it on our drive down today, but we're going down tomorrow because I'm giving this talk at the Cascade Library,
Yeah.
and we'll look for
We'll
it.
show you look for it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
What time tomorrow?
5:30. There was another hand. Yes, sir.
Well, it wasn't mine.
I think,
So I'm not next.
well, it was yours now.
I just wanted to make sure you knew that Betsy Gaines Fondant actually stood at that very podium and gave us a book talk about True West.
I saw Sarah and Millie nodding when I mentioned her name. Dawn and I met Betsy in, of all places, Seattle. Last year I went to a mystery convention, which sounds like something, she doesn't know what kind of convention it is. Well, it's mystery readers, writers, and people in the business. And I happened to meet an editor there who was Betsy's editor. And he said to me, well, she's going to be speaking in town Monday night. Well, Don and I were staying for a few days. And so what do you do for fun after 4 days at a book convention? You go hear an author speak at a book. And so we did, and we got to meet her. And she and I have become friends since then. And she's wild and delightful.
And then one question, what is your opinion of Octavia Butler?
So I have to admit that I have not read Octavia Butler, and she is having, there's kind of a resurgence of interest in the main book, whose title I've just forgotten. And so I feel like I ought to read it, but I have not yet. And for those who...
Paragon, something like that.
Parable of the Sower.
The Parable of the Sower, thank you,
Parable of
Millie.
the Sower.
Octavia Butler was an African-American science fiction and fantasy writer who died quite a while ago.
Yeah.
Highly
And
recommend.
it'll go on my list. There have been a number of books added to my list on this tour.
So I
and maybe I missed it when you talked about it, but
So-
Mary Fields was pretty old. She was like in her mid-30s when she was freed, right? If she was born in 1832 and...
Yes. She would have been around 33 when she got her freedom. And something I didn't mention, it must not be in my notes there, is we know that she was literate because she had the mail route. She had to know how to read and write. We don't know where she learned to read and write. My guess is that it was probably when she was in Toledo at the Ursuline convent. And she would have been over 40. Learning to read and write at that age is pretty remarkable.
And was she just sort of, do you think she achieved her freedom or was given her freedom during emancipation, or had she been able to achieve it earlier, or do you know anything surrounding her freedom?
I don't.
Okay.
I've not seen any documentation to indicate that that freedom was, I don't even know how to talk about it, given, recognized, whatever, in emancipation. If she was in Tennessee, it's a little complicated. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't technically apply in Tennessee because Tennessee had already surrendered. And then Tennessee got a new constitution sometime in '64, and all the slaves were freed under that constitution. But you couldn't go anywhere, really. And she could have gone to Ohio, but she might not have. We don't know. Scholarship is always changing, and documents are being discovered or reviewed for the first time, and it may be that more emerges about that to explain to answer some of these questions.
It's interesting that, I mean, she had such a life after being freed and was, in her 40s and then in her 60s living in Montana.
Right,
It's
when she
amazing.
came here, she was, she was born in 32 and came, roughly 32, and came here in 85. She was in her early 50s. And then she lived to be 82, which was a fairly long life for a woman born, very long life for a woman born back then. So, see, smoking and drinking is good for you.
And shooting guns.
And shooting guns, yes. There were other hands over here. Yeah.
I was trying to remember the name of those two books. One was Pearl Mary, and what was the other one?
Perma Red.
I knew it was something else.
Perma Red by Deborah Magpie Erling, who also wrote The Lost Journals of Sacagawea. And she talks quite a bit about York in that book. It's a really kind of an experimental fiction. She told me she was the keynote speaker at the Authors of the Flathead Writers Conference last year, and I was one of the presenters, and so we had some conversations. And she told me she pretty much invented a language because there was no written Crow, or actually, Sacagawea wasn't Crow. I'm confusing her with Mary. She was Shoshone and other tribes, and she also was living among the Mandan. She'd been kidnapped by one tribe of Indians, and she was living among the Mandan in North Dakota, what is now North Dakota, when Lewis and Clark came through, and she was forcibly married to Charbonneau. And so Erling sort of created this language. It's not easy to read, but in a different way from Perma Red. Perma Red is hard to read because it's a difficult subject matter. Sacagawea is a little bit more difficult, a little more experimental style. But it's worth the effort. It's worth the effort.
Question.
Yes?
So, I was doing some research and I found that when there was a newspaper article from the Anaconda Standard in 1913 that said Mary liked to yell at umpires when she went to baseball games.
I think we can all believe that, can't we?
Yeah. So I guess in your stories, did you touch on her affinity for baseball at all? I find that kind of fascinating that she loved baseball.
I did not. I did not. Maybe there will be more stories. After going out to the mission today, I've been really thinking about what happened in 1894. Was there really an incident, or was it just too much for the poor bishop? And so maybe a story will come from that or not. If there's another collection, though, I'll let you guys know. And I realize, and I apologize to you because you're our filmographer here, that I've been walking in and out of that camera. I'm sorry. Other questions? Yeah.
Well, she won't brag about it, but we should also ask Sarah about the one-man York show that she put on here as well.
So I did hear about the One Man York show, and I do want to know more about that, and I hope that it will be a traveling show.
He travels, so that's Hassan Davis. He is from Kentucky. I've known Hassan for years when I used to work at Lewis and Clark, but he's a great guy, and we definitely want to bring him out again. We're trying to get him out for the Lewis and Clark Trail Alliance annual meeting next year here in Great Falls. So we're going to try to get him out to come to that as well.
That would be great. That would be great. So what else can I tell you about Mary or any of the other books?
Can I just give
Yes.
Can I just give a shout out to the Crow Mary story? It's eminently readable. It's
It is.
really fun. And just a little piece. The reason she was called Crow Mary is when they baptized everybody up here, just off the. They named everybody Mary. All women were named Mary. So to differentiate her from all the other Marys, because she was Crow, they called her Crow Mary. And it was just to differentiate her from all the other Marys in town, which was everybody.
Yeah. Yes.
Next question. Do you find writing historical fiction? I know it's got to be different than writing fiction. Do you think it's more difficult? Is it just a different way of writing versus entirely fiction, or how is it different for you?
It is more difficult than writing contemporary fiction because while I have to do research for contemporary stories, I know the world. And I know how people live and think in these times. With historical fiction, you have to get the history as right as you can, and you have to acknowledge you're going to make mistakes. And that part was really hard for me. I've got an 8-page single-spaced timeline of everything that I could find from when Lewis and Clark came here to when the last owner I knew of the property that had been the mission, because I never knew what was going to be important. When you do the research, you're not just checking what was that gun called. You're looking at the whole world, and that made it really challenging. So I don't know that I'll do a whole lot more historical fiction, but as I said, there are some Mary stories still calling to me, and there is another historical Montana figure who interests me as well.
But you're not prepared to say who.
Yes, I can tell you. It was an artist named Frey Dana who lived in the southeastern part of the state for quite a long time, and then eventually lived outside of Cascade, oddly. Although I don't know just where. I'm not quite ready to dive into the research for her. She was a painter. She trained at the Cincinnati School of Art, which was quite well known. That's where she lived as a young woman. She trained with Joseph Sharp, and she studied in Paris with Merritt Chase and all kinds of other famous people you've heard of. Even if you're not a huge fan of either Western art or American Impressionism, you've heard of some of these people. And then she married a man named Edwin Dana, a banker, who wrote his biography and forgot to mention that he had a wife. So that tells you a lot right there. What Frey said about her painting is, I can fight the world and win, but I can't fight the world and Edwin too. And she gave up her painting. And I have always wondered, what if she kept going? What would have happened? And then she did take it up again in later years. So if you know anything about Frey, Leslie at lesliebudewitz.com. What else can I tell you? Well, thank you very much for coming tonight. Sarah for being open when I invited myself. And when I was scheduling these visits, this is my, sixth of 7 library visits plus a handful of bookstores in about 3 weeks. So it's Tuesday, it must be Great Falls. When I was scheduling these, I was also applying to join the Humanities Montana Speakers Bureau. And that is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. What it does is cover expenses for talks like these, plus a small stipend, and talks are given at schools, libraries, and museums across the state. It's a tremendous resource. I'd hoped that if I was accepted, then the libraries could apply to the program for funding for these events. I was accepted, and 2 days later, the funding for the National Endowment for the Humanities and all those programming was canceled, funding which Congress had specifically authorized. And so I am grateful to your library for providing an honorarium, as the other libraries I've been to have done that too. And I want to urge you, please, to advocate for your libraries at the local level and at the national level for the restoration of NEH funding and for funding of IMLS, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, because they are critical sources of funding, and these are lifeblood institutions. I realize I'm preaching to the choir here. The libraries and the small museums that we treasure here in the Treasure State are an essential part of remembering our history. And we need to remember our history so we can better understand the present and prepare for the future. So thank you. I do have books available here. There is a newsletter sign-up sheet we tucked at the front door next to the library sign-up sheet. And I am happy to visit with you. And thank you again for coming out tonight.
Thank you everybody for coming out tonight. I hope that you learned some information. Just a quick reminder that Stagecoach Mary was also featured in Feisty Women of Great Falls and in the documentary that was produced. We do have a QR code upstairs on the bulletin board and next to the by the water fountain as well, next to the big article about Alma Smith Jacobs, because she was also featured in that. So if you want to check that out, scan that QR code. It's a beautifully done documentary and it's absolutely amazing. As always, we have lots going on here at the library. More author talks, more programming. Summer's coming, so guess what that means? Music! Music in the Park is also coming, and that whole lineup has been announced and is on our website as well. The next big event that we have going on here at the library is May 29th. We are doing another documentary showing with Indie Lens Pop-Up and PBS, and that is My Alzheimer's, and we decided why not make a day of it. So we actually have a whole lineup of things going on for that event. Starting at 4 o'clock, we're going to be doing memory screenings with the Weissman Hood Institute. We'll do Tai Chi with DPHHS right here in this room. And then we have a research update from the Weissman Hood Institute at 5. And then we will actually have the documentary at 6:30. But don't worry, because you're going to be here from 4 to 8. I'm also serving you dinner. So dinner is provided by the Highgate Senior Living. So we have a lot going on. That's May 29th. Come down for that. And stay tuned for all of the other fun things that we have going on. Thank you again for coming out.